Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The Echo in the Library Basement. The library basement was the kind of place people avoided unless they absolutely had to go down there. It wasn't just because of the flickering fluorescent lights or the constant hum of old pipes. It was because the place seemed off, cold in a way the rest of the building wasn't. Still, when the head librarian told me I had to sort through the old archives stored below, I didn't argue. I needed the job, and shelving forgotten boxes of books sounded harmless enough. The first time I walked down the narrow staircase, the air shifted around me, heavy and damp, as though I'd stepped into a cavern instead of a storage floor. Rows of steel shelving stretched endlessly, filled with dusty binders, yellowed papers, and cardboard boxes sagging under their own weight. The silence was thick, broken only by the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. I tried to shake it off, but there was something about the way sound carried down there. It wasn't normal. When I dropped a pen, the metallic clink seemed to linger, bouncing around as if the basement refused to let it go. By my third day, I noticed something stranger. I was whispering to myself, a nervous habit, nothing new. As I read labels on boxes, I muttered, 1987 records, 1988 reports. But after each word, something answered. Not right away, not like a clean echo. It was delayed, a second voice repeating what I said back to me, softer, stretched, like a recording being dragged slowly across a tape player. I froze the first time I heard it. The silence was so total that the word came back too clear to dismiss as imagination. Reports, reports. The voice was higher than mine, almost childlike, and it carried a breathy rasp. I tried to laugh it off. Probably the acoustics, I whispered. The basement whispered back. Acoustics. That was when I realized it wasn't my voice at all. It was something else mimicking me. Over the next week, I tested it. Sometimes it didn't answer, but more often than not, it did. I'd say something simple like box A12, and a moment later the voice would echo, A12? Except sometimes the word would warp. A12 became Eightwell, slurred and strange. It was never exact, and then it got bolder. One evening, I stayed later than usual, the library nearly empty upstairs. As I organized a stack of brittle newspapers, I whispered out of habit, almost done. The echo came back, done. But then it added something I hadn't said. Stay. My throat went dry. I stood there for a full minute, staring into the aisles of shelves as though someone might step out. But there was no one. Just shadows stretching long under the flickering light. I didn't tell anyone, because how do you explain something like that? But I started working faster, trying to minimize my time down there. Of course, the librarians kept piling more tasks on me. Catalog this, organize that. And every time I descended the stairs, I braced myself for the voice. The worst part was how it started guessing. One afternoon, I whispered box 7 scene C. The echo came back instantly, almost overlapping my voice. 17C, except I hadn't even finished the phrase before it repeated. As if it had already known what I was going to say. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed wondering if I'd imagined it, if maybe I was so used to the repetitions that I was confusing timing. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was anticipating me, listening. The final night I went down there, the air felt wrong before I even reached the basement. Heavy, electric. My skin prickled like I'd walked into a storm cloud. I told myself I'd be quick. Grab the files, head back up. As I reached the middle aisle, I whispered to myself, almost finished. The basement answered before I could take another step. Finished. I froze. My hands shook as I stacked the files. I didn't want to say another word. But then, clear as if someone stood just behind me, I heard the voice whisper without my prompting. Don't leave. My stomach dropped. That was the first time it had spoken without repeating me. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked the boxes over. No one was there. The shelves stretched out into darkness, the single overhead light buzzing weakly. Heart pounding, I rushed toward the stairs. My footsteps echoed harshly, overlapping, too many, like something else was running alongside me, just out of sight. When I reached the steps, I glanced back, because some awful part of me needed to know if anything was following. I wish I hadn't. At the far end of the basement, in the place the light didn't reach, a shape stood at the end of the aisle. It wasn't clear, more like a shadow gathered together into a body. But I saw the mouth, wide, stretching too far, opening silently as though it were waiting to form my next word. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I told the head librarian I couldn't work down there anymore. Made up some excuse about allergies, dust, whatever. She didn't even argue, just nodded slowly like she already knew. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else hears it, if the whispers are still echoing in that cold, damp basement, waiting, repeating. And I wonder, if I ever go back down there, will it still echo me, or will it finally speak first? Story 2, When the Mirror Answered Back. People often dismiss whispers as tricks of the mind, half-formed thoughts brushing against the edge of consciousness. But what happens when those whispers don't just echo your thoughts, but answer them? Lena wasn't someone prone to superstition. She was a doctoral student in psychology, someone who believed that every haunting, every eerie experience could be boiled down to stress, suggestion, or the brain misfiring. But her skepticism didn't prepare her for the mirror in her apartment. The mirror wasn't anything special at first glance. She had picked it up secondhand from an antique shop, a tall, gilded thing with a tarnished frame that looked elegant against the wall of her small bedroom. She liked the way it caught the light in the morning, how it made her cramped space feel a little larger. The shopkeeper had practically begged her to take it, offering it for half the price without much bargaining. Lena assumed it was just old inventory they wanted gone. The first night it happened, Lena was sitting at her desk, reviewing notes for a paper. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She was chewing on her pen when a thought crossed her mind. A fleeting self-criticism she often repeated to herself. I'm never going to finish this degree. From behind her, clear as if someone were leaning over her shoulder, came a whisper. You won't. She froze. The pen slipped from her fingers. The sound hadn't been her imagination. It had tone, depth, the slight rasp of breath. She turned sharply, heart thundering, but the apartment was empty. Her eyes landed on the mirror. Her reflection looked back at her, calm and unchanged, but something about it felt wrong. The room around her reflection seemed darker, the shadows deeper. She shook it off, telling herself it was stress, maybe a fragment of her own voice rebounding in her head. Still, she moved her study sessions to the kitchen for the next few nights. But the whispers didn't stop. Sometimes they echoed her private thoughts. Sometimes they finished her sentences. One evening, as she stared at the stack of books on her desk, she muttered out loud, "This is impossible." From the mirror came a whisper, low and deliberate. Then, quit. Lena tried to laugh it off, but she couldn't ignore the way the voice seemed to know exactly what she was thinking before she had even fully formed the words. Worse, it was starting to say things she hadn't thought at all. When she pulled an all-nighter, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, the whisper came again, curling up from the glass. You don't belong here. Another night, while brushing her teeth, she thought she heard it hiss. He's watching you. Her stomach dropped. She spun, staring into the mirror. For the first time, her reflection didn't match her movements. Her hand, mid-brush, stilled in front of her mouth, but the reflection's hand moved a beat later, almost like it was hesitating. Lena backed away. She covered the mirror with a bedsheet after that. For days, she avoided it, using only the bathroom mirror when she needed to get ready. But at night, just as she began to drift off, she would hear the faint rustle of the sheets sliding against the frame, and beneath it, the whispers. Why are you hiding? You wanted to see. Let me answer you again. Her sleep grew shallow, fractured. She caught herself thinking in circles, as if her own mind was being fed back to her, rearranged and corrupted. At one point, she wondered if she was hallucinating from lack of rest. Until one evening, when she returned home after class and found the sheet neatly folded at the foot of her bed. The mirror was uncovered. Her reflection stood waiting. Lena's heart lurched into her throat. She hadn't touched the mirror all week, but her reflection was off again. Its smile didn't match hers. In fact, she wasn't smiling at all. She whispered without meaning to. What do you want from me? The reflection's lips moved. For the first time, the whisper didn't come from behind her. It came directly from the glass. I want your voice. The The sound rattled through her bones. Lena stumbled back, knocking into her desk. The reflection laughed, a dry, airy sound, though her own mouth was clamped shut. Panicked, Lena grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, refusing to touch it again. She considered getting rid of it, but something inside her, a gnawing fear, told her the mirror didn't want to be discarded. She remembered the desperation of the shopkeeper, the way they'd pushed it on her. Had they known? That night, her dreams were filled with whispers, like 100 versions of her own voice chanting in unison. When she woke, she was hoarse, her throat raw as if she'd been speaking aloud in her sleep. She reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, but in the dim glow of the screen, she saw movement in the corner of her eye. The mirror, still covered, trembled. The blanket slid slowly down the glass, as if pulled from the other side, and in the sliver revealed, Lena saw her reflection waiting. Its lips curled into a knowing smile. Then, without sound, it mouthed her thought before she even had it. "You can't escape me." For the first time, Lena believed it. Story 3. The voice behind the bedroom door. It started with the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, the kind where every tick of the clock seems amplified, and the shadows lean a little closer than they should. Aaron lay awake in his bedroom, the dim glow of his alarm clock casting a soft red hue across the walls. He had just turned off the last of the lights in the house when he noticed it. The silence was too complete, too heavy, as if the world outside his window had held its breath. Aaron lived alone in a 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't ancient, not the kind of place you'd expect to hold curses or legends, just an ordinary suburban home, too ordinary to explain what happened next. At first, the sound was so soft, he thought he imagined it. A faint murmur, as though someone was talking far away. He sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whisper grew clearer, closer, until it seemed to be coming from right outside his bedroom door. "Aaron?" The voice was low, hushed, but it carried the unmistakable familiarity of someone who knew him. His chest tightened. He hadn't had visitors in weeks, and no one else had a key. He froze, staring at the thin strip of light beneath the door, half expecting to see shadows moving. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd left the TV on downstairs, though he was certain he'd turned everything off. He climbed out of bed, his legs trembling, and pressed his ear against the door. Silence. For a moment, he almost laughed at himself, but then it came again, clearer now. "Aaron, open the door." His blood ran cold. The voice sounded like his own. Not exactly. There was a distortion, as if it were being replayed on old, warped tape. He staggered backward, staring at the door, at the familiar paint chips and brass handle that suddenly seemed sinister. He wanted to call someone, but who would believe him? Instead, he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The voice came again, this time urgent, pressing, "You know me. Let me in." Aaron's throat went dry. He whispered back before he could stop himself, "Who are you?" Silence. Then a low chuckle that didn't belong to him, though it still carried his tone, his cadence. It was his voice stripped of warmth, hollowed out into something that sounded inhuman. "I'm you," it whispered. Aaron felt a sickness churn in his stomach. His instincts screamed at him to run, but where? To leave meant crossing the threshold where the voice lingered. His mind raced for explanations, sleep paralysis, a dream, a stress hallucination, but the sound was too sharp, too real. He stood frozen for what felt like hours, the whisper ebbing and flowing, sometimes gentle, sometimes commanding. At one point, it began repeating his thoughts back to him, like a mocking echo. When he thought, "This isn't real," the voice repeated it with a sly inflection. When he thought of calling for help, it hissed, call for help, no one will come." Desperate, Aaron decided to test it. He thought of something random, a song lyric from his childhood. Within seconds, the voice crooned it back to him from behind the door. His knees buckled, and he realized with dawning horror that whatever this thing was, it wasn't guessing. It was inside his head. He wanted to scream, but terror had his throat in a vice. Instead, he forced himself toward the window. Maybe he could climb out and run into the night, neighbor's house be damned. He pulled the curtains back, fumbled with the latch, then froze. A reflection stared back at him in the glass, but it wasn't his. The face had his features, but the eyes were too dark, too wide, and the grin stretched too far. Slowly, it raised a finger to its lips. "Shh!" the voice whispered, though his double's lips didn't move. Aaron stumbled backward, his body trembling so violently he nearly collapsed. He turned toward the door, and that's when he saw it. The handle was turning. Not fast, not forceful, but slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever stood outside was savoring the moment. He bolted for the dresser, dragging it across the floor with all his strength, blocking the door. The wood creaked as he shoved it into place, sweat pouring down his face. The handle rattled once more, then stopped. For a long time, silence pressed in on him. He stayed there, crouched on the floor, his phone light shaking in his hand. Finally, he dared to believe it was over. Maybe he'd imagined everything. Maybe his mind was unraveling. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking slightly, and tried to breathe. Then, from the other side of the door, the whisper returned, softer than ever, yet clearer than anything he'd ever heard. "You can block the door, Aaron, but you can't block me. I'm already inside." His phone died at that exact moment, plunging the room into darkness. And from the corner of his bedroom, the darkest corner, the one he hadn't dared to look at all night, something shifted, unseen but heavy, breathing in rhythm with him. Aaron realized with absolute certainty that whatever had spoken behind the door was no longer waiting outside. It had crossed over, and it wasn't leaving. Whispers that echo your own mind are not easily forgotten. They linger long after the sound has gone, leaving you wondering whether it was imagination or something else entirely. If you've ever felt a thought wasn't truly your own, or heard your voice return from the darkness, you're not alone. Sometimes the scariest voices are the ones that sound just like us.